Womxn, thank you so much for being so generous with your time and also opening your home to us at the Forge. We're really grateful that we can have this conversation with you, to get to know you better and to get to learn from you. I'm personally very honored that I'm here today and I can have the conversation with you in person. So this is really for me to say thank you so much for all the generosity and all the very smooth planning. So we really want to say we appreciate you and we appreciate your time. So thank you so much. It's also important for us, the work that you've done and you continue to do. And this is why this International Women's Future for us is actually very, very important, and we're honored that you have found the time. We know that you're very busy, but you've made time and been really generous for us to be here and be able to have this interview. So thank you so much.
Not to mention.
Okay, so I'm going to get right into the conversation. Of course, I have been introduced to you through the work that you've done, through the activism, the role you played in the anti-apartheid movement. So I would like for us to maybe talk about you for a bit and for us to share anything that you'd like to share about yourself. So maybe I think we could start there. If you could share anything that you'd like to share about yourself, it could be your upbringing, anything that you'd like to share.
Okay. Well, I was born to a family of 5 sisters and a brother in the very rural town of Dundee, Northern Natal. It was a difficult time in 1948, of course, and it was the time of the nationalist government, and that's the irony of my birth, but yet in another way it was, I think, the seed was actually embedded in my soul, in my being there, born at that particular time so that I could forge a way forward in my life. So all through my life experiences, being the only girl child to have matriculated, and through a hard, very difficult time my father had in trying to find funds for me to go to university. I fought to go to university. I then pursued my dream of getting into Salisbury Island, a university for so-called the Indian community. And I graduated from there, and my first job was then to teach a community of learners in Chatsworth. And it was there that I really found my political home in terms of looking at what exactly happened in communities that were dispossessed of their homes. And thereafter, obviously, having so-called politicized and conscientized my students through various activities, because it was mainly through the experiential learning that I then was placed under a banning order and house arrest for 5 years. And it was very difficult, obviously. I was banned when my first child was born, in fact imprisoned first, when I was 4 months pregnant. And then came the banning order. and didn't know when and where I would get the next meal from. Then it was my whole consciousness led me to believe that I had to get back into teaching, and I managed to start research for a school for children with cerebral palsy. There were no schools for disabilities in those days. And since then till now, I'm still working as one would, because of one's belief in bringing together people with disabilities, because of them not having a voice, not having a platform. It's one issue that is marginalized in society, and it encompasses all aspects of our belief in how people are marginalized. So, yeah, and here I am still volunteering for children with autism.
Thank you so much, Mom Sam, for sharing parts of your life that, to me when I listen, were very difficult. But also, you've just reminded me really, really what we mean when we say the political is personal. Because sometimes it is these stories that we get to hear from people. It is, the lived experiences, the things that people got to live through, that again remind us of the importance of the causes we find ourselves in. And we're really grateful for your life, and we're really grateful that even today you find the strength to be in community with people that are living difficult lives and are struggling. So we really respect that, and we really, when I say we're grateful for your life, I mean that from the depth of my heart. So thank you once again for sharing. So I think you partly covered this question, but I think there's value in talking about it more, because you've already shared some of the personal reasons why you got into activism. But maybe I will ask the question this way to say, is there anything else that you could share with us about your personal reasons for your activism in the anti-apartheid struggle specifically?
Okay, so like I said, my birth, that particular year has great significance for me. It was it was a seed that was planted. I think it was purposeful. There was a purpose for my birth on that year. And it was only later on, through my lived experiences and all the experiences that I had, that pushed me towards why I became who I am today. Starting from the very early days of my following in the footsteps of my dad. It was through him. He worked through welfare organizations where I saw and felt what it was for him to fight for people who were homeless. How he fought to build schools, both primary and high school, so that we could get an education. It was through all the hard work of being that kind of foot soldier, which I became a foot soldier later on, knowing that he set an example for what it was to be in community and to see what people were going through. So I was really that little one traipsing around with him, going around and looking at what it is to live impoverished lives, besides our own personal impoverished lives, where we had a family of 6. He had to have 2 jobs, drive a taxi, be a clerk, or find means of getting us an education. And of course it was both my parents who taught us all the time values, the values that gave me a trust into what it is to be human, what it is when you don't have, what it is to know that if you don't, you have to respect what little you get. And the most important value was that you have to have respect. Respect for the elders, respect for being spoken to, or speak only when you're spoken to, listen and respect and before you even speak, you got to think and adjust. Don't just speak for the sake of speaking. But we were given the right to be able to air our views. Yes. And it was also our religious upbringing and the thought that my mother would say, charity begins at home. You can't go out into the world and try to do things if you are not charitable at home, in terms of, as soon as the light was on at home, we all had to be respectful of each other. We didn't argue. We were open to discussions, but my father would make sure that there was no screaming and shouting. But so it was a very harmonious household. So that was where we started. But my real politicization came at high school, where we didn't have teachers in matric. We didn't have teachers in various subjects, and teachers were sent to us on punitive measures, and they came in there and refused to teach subjects that they were not qualified in. And we then had to learn to teach ourselves. So that concept of each one teach one came from that root of knowing that we had to make it on our own. And that's true, because when later on, when I learned about Steve and Barney Pitana talking about black woman, you're on your own, I realized what it actually meant. And I was fortunate to have that opportunity to be able to do things for myself, learn, study, on your own, make decisions. And it only came from my upbringing. So in that sense, that was how I became who I am. So that kind of resilience and that resistance to realizing that nobody was there to do things for me. I had to do it on my own. And so when I came to university, so my consciousness of who I was and what I was to become started in my roots. Then going to university was another aspect. A university which was a tribal university. We called it bush colleges in those days. Tribal in the sense that there was universities for Zulu-speaking people in Ngoya, Zululand. You had the University of the North. We were forced to go to the University for so-called Indians on Salisbury Island. And while you were there, you realized there were so many laws and rules, so stringent. We started to question the kinds of education we were receiving. It was we were really not brainwashed, I would say we were whitewashed. We couldn't question, we had no chance of having debates, discussions. We couldn't integrate with other students from other universities. There were so many restrictions. And you just realized that it was time that you started to ask, what is this curriculum all about? The kind of education that we were receiving as university students was questionable. Was it an education for subservience? What was the hidden agenda? Were we there to become mouthpieces of a white education system? We started to be critical in analyzing what it is that we are being taught. The very fact that you couldn't ask or even question your lecturers, and the kinds, all the books were being, especially in history, which is your subject, written by Afrikaner writers. And so we didn't understand, and we didn't even know anything about black literature, black writers. That was far well out of, it was all Eurocentric. No matter whether it was from the English department or whether it was the drama department. One of the biggest failures was the fact that we weren't given a range of books to compare critical thinking. So you had to, whatever you were given, you had to regurgitate in the exam and you got through. If you deviated in your thinking, you were penalized for it. So yes, so that was, that is when we started to rethink. And we realized that there were lots of books that were banned, that we didn't have access to. And that is when we started to join groups of students who were thinking politically and began to read outside of what was given to us. The books were banned. We had to look at what today you would, in those days we call it subversive literature. Today it's fairly available to you, and you're lucky. We couldn't even read people like, we didn't know African writers, for instance. So, I mean, to read about the revolutions that were happening throughout Africa, to learn about people like Lumumba, to learn about Senghor, it was all hidden literature. To go beyond and go to Mao Zedong, know about Marx, those were like, you couldn't even utter those names. Leave alone the American literature, from Malcolm X to Angela Davis to, it was most exciting. But if we were found, and our homes were broken into, if we were found with that kind of literature, we were arrested. And people think that it was easy for us. It was very difficult. We would have books under our beds, in somebody else's homes, form little groups where we could sit, talk and discuss. The kind of draconian laws just on literature itself was like, we were totally silenced, and we couldn't utter what we were even thinking, because then we were regarded as being political, and it was quite not accepted. So that was university. Then my politicization was further enhanced when I became a teacher. And when I became a teacher and I went to Chatsworth, it was there that I understood what it was that my students were going through. Living in homes or living in conditions where crowded conditions. And I was teaching learners whose families had come from being affected by the Group Areas Act. So, you know, what you see today is still a replica of what was then. Crowded conditions led to unemployment. Unemployment led to rape, hunger, starvation, poverty, pregnant students, drugs being sold. Then you also had gangs formed. Now those are the conditions under which we taught. But it led to my methodology, it led to my experiences, experiential learning. And it was experiential teaching. And it was those conditions that led me to believe that our learners, and I mean, I was an English teacher, I was a drama teacher. I used their lived experiences to get them to understand who they were in terms of their identities and why they were or what they would become if they do not do something about it. So that is how the political, working in community with my students, getting them to write about what they've seen, what they've experienced, politicizing them about the economic and social conditions, of course, led to my banning and my house arrest. But knowing fully well that I also used the texts. For instance, we took Animal Farm and we rewrote the text as a play. And one of the things that I was reason for my being dismissed from the education department, I only lasted there for 3 years. I was dismissed from the education department because they said I was politicizing my students. I was teaching them communism, they said. The impact of the students, we did a number of things then. It was like exchanges of information in clusters of schools, student exchanges, with not only their writing, but newsletters, their artwork, their drama pieces. So in cluster schools, we would have lunchtime programs, even evening candlelight theatre, weekend programs. We started street theatre. The students started their own theatre group. Many of them were arrested for that after I was dismissed. But the process of saying that one has the power to effect change in the way people think. So, and nothing really stops you from engaging them and empowering them. Every day we would read excerpts from Soledad Brothers, George Jackson's prison writings, for instance, and use that for them to understand the impact of the socio-political conditions on their lived experiences. So it was for me important to see that education was not just for reading and writing and becoming a cog in the machine of how things were going for them. And it was for me an education for revolt, an education for resistance, an education for understanding themselves. So that was, and that is where after being dismissed, I found my home within Black community programs. At the same time as Steve Biko being, both of us were actually, him being kicked out of University of Natal, and I was kicked out of the education department. Both of us joined in, and I mean, it was through him that he then said to me, look, whatever you're doing, they used to come and watch many of my productions, and he said, you are doing what Black community programs should be doing. And that is how I got into Black community programs.
Okay. Thank you so much for sharing so much of that. I have so much to follow up on that, and then we'll talk about the Black community programs later on. But maybe let me just ask one question. The idea of a different methodology for education. So you say your methodology is for revolt and resistance. But also earlier you spoke about the education system and how many of you felt like you were on your own, and you spoke about how you were on your own and then took the responsibility to educate yourselves in different ways. It's very clear when you talk about your methodology, what's the reasons why you chose that particular methodology were. I'm interested in maybe your reading of the education system back then. It could also be today, your reading of it, and what kinds of students, if we will, it tries to produce and reproduce, and for what purpose? Because yours is very clear that there's something very wrong about the kinds of educations we were getting. And so we felt the need to think about a different kind of methodology, which was for resistance. But also, I'm interested in, what it is that you were resisting in the education system, or the kind of education that at the time you were being offered, and whether or not you think today it's any different, or there's more work to be done, and education even today has to be done differently. So I'm interested in your thoughts about that, the education system.
Okay, so if my whole approach was experiential learning for experiential teaching.
Yes.
Education had to go back into the community. Mm-hmm. So when the students wrote, they wrote from their direct experience. So they had to get involved in community also. They were not outsiders. They're in community, and they had to bring the community into the schools and the schools into community. So that was the approach. For instance, over weekends, they had to then, or even after school. It was firstly after school and then over weekends. The students went into looking at what the parents were going through. They had to go out and do things like go and shop for your mother who's ailing. Take anybody in, there were street committees. Do anything that you feel that somebody is in need. If there's somebody who cannot go to the shop to go and buy groceries and you are able to, you go and do the shopping for them. If there is a light fixture, there's no lights, and if you can do it, go and help to fix it. Even if a gate, you've been swinging on that gate and that gate broke, you go and fix that gate. You take somebody and accompany them to hospitals, and during and while you're in there, observe, and you come back and you write about it. I would also use a multisensory approach to writing, where I would say to, and there were like gangs and thugs and drugs, and they were in my class as well. There was one time a student stabbed another. I was writing on the board, and when I turned around, he took his pencil and stabbed him, and blood spurted out. And we had very few teachers, and I ran out of the classroom, got hold of the principal, and we had to take the child to hospital. They had to write about it, what they went through, what they felt, what they experienced. I mean, the shock, the fear, in some cases the anger. So we use the emotional experiences to let them write about their experience. So no matter what they went through, there was one of the guys who was a peddler after school, and everybody knew about it, and but was a brilliant student. The rest of the staff and teachers didn't like him because he was a severe stutterer and stammerer. One week, the weekend that he was writing getting ready for his paper on a Monday English paper, he was in prison. And the afternoon, I had to beg the principal for us to go and get him out of prison for him to write that paper, because I believed in him. The principal was angry, but the domestic science teachers made sandwiches and we took it to the prison. In the area, we got him released, got him to eat something, and I said to the principal, he will write that paper in your room and you will mark it. And he was shocked. It was a literature paper. And this child, you know, the question of us believing in first and foremost, and understanding what it is to come from a deprived community. That community was a very, very impoverished community. It was one of the worst sections of Chatsworth. But to build confidence in your community, you've got to see that the parents need to know that you are interested in the education of their children. And then I would bring in the parents over the weekend, get the kids to do performances because they were deprived of anything that is cultural. So bring them into the schools and let them, we don't have stages, we don't have halls, but we do it in the corridors, we do it in between classes, no matter where you are. And I taught the students that. Using your drama skills, no matter where you are, you can create theatre, you can create drama. And we worked over weekends. We didn't say that our jobs stopped at 3 o'clock every afternoon. We stayed till 5 or 6 in the evening, and those kids would know that I would be alone, and they would get on the buses with those conductors, travel with me, see that I was at home, and then got back on the buses and got back home. But that was the commitment to, and them understanding why education was important. So it's a question of, it was my process of learning how to conscientize, and also understanding of I belong. So whenever you talk about education, community education, people must understand, where do you come from? Always go back to where you come from and contribute to that upliftment. It is your responsibility because it was your parents who struggled hard enough to get you where you are, and it is your duty to go back to your roots and educate your community. So that's how community education started. It was also the fact we started something that was very new. Parents at that stage, because of unemployment, we got, for instance, the typing teacher. We used to call him the typing teacher. To start bringing in the unemployed parents for evening classes and to teach typing. Now, all their brothers, all their sisters were unemployed. So that was one of the ways. There was one brilliant student whose parents did not know how to read and write. She went home each day and she taught her parents to read and taught the parents to write. One does not look down or shy away from and say, oh, our parents can't read and write, and therefore they... But it's your duty, and also to share what you learn with your parents, so that they, or the household, so that the people know what you are learning. Do not divorce your education, because you now they're going to matriculate and go out of school, and they knew that if they left their homes without their parents knowing what they had learned. So it was that process of each one, again, that my each one teach one at school where we did not have teachers, played its role when I became a teacher as well.
Learning so much about what it means to serve a community in the best way that you know how, and also with the resources and the knowledge available and skills available to you. I'm learning so much about that in this conversation. And maybe we can talk about something similar, to talk about the Black community programs and what those were and how those were related to the Black consciousness movement. Maybe let's start with connected to sort of the conversation that we've just been having. Let's start with the Black community programs, what those were. And the reason I would like for us to talk about the Black community programs is for us to also draw lessons from the work of the Black community programs, because I'm thinking of how we can build and create when faced with enormous difficulties. And, that's a lesson that's also relevant today when, for instance, comrades in movements, comrades in organized labor organizations are trying to build, but faced with a lot of repression and sometimes as bad as assassinations. So maybe, the reason I asked that question is for us to draw lessons from the Black community programs. So, how can we learn from the Black community programs? What lessons can we draw about how people build and create in times when they are faced with enormous difficulties? So if you could share some lessons.
So obviously Black community programs and is based on the philosophy of Black consciousness.
Yes.
And I think one needs to go back to what Black consciousness is all about, and how that impacts, because it is that level of consciousness that creates opportunities to face those challenges that we face every day. So where do you start with one's Black consciousness? And you would have read about it in books, but again, Black consciousness stems from the fact that it is a philosophy of life. It's life itself. It's the movement. Black community programs comes from a movement of Black consciousness. And so obviously, historically, we can understand it from the very fact that Black people have been designated as, in the most negative of terms. You've been insulted and been racialized by negative terms. You've been assaulted by all the insults and indignities of being subhuman or being non-white. All the negativity of the term non-white impinges upon one's psyche when one then begins to feel unworthy, useless. You feel unwanted, not needed, less than, inferior. Name everything under the sun that you've been called to being by white racist people, by the nationalist government, the institutionalization of racism, of how you've been treated. So that the first starting point was, then we needed to look at Black consciousness then started in terms of one's self, understanding who you are, your identity. So it was self-realization of you as a being. So Black community programs, who are you in terms of where you come from, your being. So first is self-realization. Then it was self-affirmation. Self-affirmation as to affirming yourself, understanding that you are a being and your humanity, finding your humanity within yourself. So it was an inward journey. An inward journey of understanding your kind of psychological oppression. That we are oppressed people, and as oppressed people, we also have pride, we also have dignity, and we need to assert ourselves. So the last part was self-assertion. So the three levels of programs for Black community programs: self-realization, self-affirmation, and self-assertion. Three vital programs, which was the thrust on which we then based as to, so where did we come from? Who are we? And we had to be self-defined, and we were never going to be defined by anybody else. Hence the word Black. And people misconstrue what Blackness is all about. And people think that Blackness is the color of one's skin. And it's got to do with pigmentation. The whole idea of Blackness had to do with seeking one's humanity. And if we only know that, and obviously there were definitions. So it was Blackness had to do with values of pride and respect. It had to do with attitudes of inclusion rather than exclusion. It had to do with how we look at each other and how do we support and protect each other. Support and protect each other in community. And that is what Black community programs is all about. So the basis and the foundation of Black community programs was then also into the whole concept of its definition of people who are socially, economically, and politically discriminated against and oppressed. That's the normal. And looking at those three words, socially, politically, and economically. And hence, using that, and most important, of course, is all those who seek their liberation, or who are involved in their liberation. Let me tell you that there are people who are non-whites. Of course, there was the fact that we fought against being non-white. But the truth of the matter was there were non-whites. And today, there are still non-whites. There are lots of non-whites who do not believe in the liberation, and that is what Black consciousness is all about. It believes in the liberation of the mind. It believes in the liberation of the self. It believes in the dignity and pride of Black people to go out there and liberate themselves. So unless you do not believe in liberation, then you're non-white. If you cannot liberate yourself, then who are you? And you cannot liberate your Black brother or sister. Who are you? That is where your identity and self-recognition and self-affirmation of yourself to go out and do something about your social, political, and economic oppression in this country. So, in that sense, Black community programs looked at and the most important thing, obviously, again, is the whole question of solidarity. Solidarity obviously stemmed from the very fact that we were fighting. When we talked about Black also, this whole concept of people being divided by being called so-called Indian, so-called African, so-called colored, so-called white. So-called. We are not. And we are divided by the racialized situations we're in by so-called race, and we believe in there being only one race, and that is the human race. You know, unless I see you as a person, as a being, I cannot see you as so-called African. I can't live like that. How do you live without seeing a person? You see a person because you're told. And we know that the whole divide and rule policy was to create mistrust, create fear, create lack of respect for each other, and that is what Black consciousness is all about. And if you see what's happening today, can we not apply that level of consciousness, of understanding that we are human first? And that's been our fight, for which we were banned, house arrested, and also understanding that we did not, it's a collective consciousness of being with each other, and to break all barriers and all whatever, but to live with each other. It's still a fight today. So that then brings us to, okay, so what are our programs? You know, it's easy to talk about our programs and say, can we replicate, can we do the same? Material conditions have changed, but there are things that we did to bring community together. And I want to just quote, for instance, one of the philosophers that we really followed, and that was the Chinese philosopher, Lao Tzu. And he said, go to the people, live with them, learn from them, start with what they know, build with what they have, and when the work is done, the people will say, we have done it ourselves. Not somebody else coming in there and deciding what to do for communities. This is where Black consciousness has played a vital role in trying to get communities to break away from this dependency. So what was our basic framework? We had to get communities to mop up. M-O-P. Right? First, mop up your communities. Mobilize. M. Mobilize. Mobilize your resources. Mobilize your people. Organize yourselves. And P. See the power within yourselves.
Sure.
Because, and the only reason to do that was to break the dependency that people were creating. Because even up till today, there is all this question of sitting back and waiting for somebody else to bring in the help. Somebody else to, because and the whole concept of, I am entitled to that. I will wait for it. So the whole question is, no. You have to mop up. You've got to go and mobilize yourselves. You've got to get your communities organized, and you've got to see that you have the ability and the power to do things for yourself. So that is how Black community programs, the basis for it. But also there was this, you know, man is an island. You have to learn to work with each other. You know, if you look at all the organizations that are doing the same work as you are, can we not get these organizations to come together as one and not fight each other for funding? We all have a common enemy, and at this moment is capital.
Yes.
So each one, it is a question of survival. And each organization, I'm speaking from the fact that to date, as I stand here, there is no help for autism, for the disability struggle. We're still fighting a struggle within the disability sector. The government hasn't given you a cent, not even a penny, to even start an organization when there are more than 200,000 people with autism out in the community. But we had to mobilize parents to start it. We have to organize ourselves to get a school going, and we had to say to the parents, that power of the education of people with disabilities is in your hands. I mean, that is the basic thing. But when it came to understanding this fact about our programs not being just only within, we then realized that we had to work with other organizations. So with the medical students, for instance. We worked with the South African Students' Organization. We worked, our political programs worked with the Black People's Convention. With the students, medical students, what did we do? We realized that health was an important factor. We realized that kids were not being immunized for polio. Weekends, we went out and we had vaccination programs in the community. Awareness of what happens if your kids are not vaccinated. Went, set up clinics, whether it was KwaMashu, whether it was Wentworth, whether it was Inanda. We set up those clinics.
I really, really would love to hear just a little bit more about mop-up. And because, you know, my thinking is also that to think about, you know, some strategies for resilience, and maybe to get your thoughts on whether you think that commitment to mop up was one of the main things that kept the resilience going, and what we can learn from, you know, being committed, you know, to the mobilizing, to the organizing, but also to taking very seriously the idea of people's power. So maybe the short question I'm trying to ask is, would you say the idea of being committed to this notion of mop-up was one of the main ways to keep people resilient? That commitment to mobilizing, that commitment to organizing, that commitment to the idea of people's power, really believing in people's power. Yeah, so maybe I'd like to hear your thoughts on that, and maybe share some insights.
Okay. So you touched on a very good word, is commitment. You know, the ethics of volunteerism has been eroded over the years. People don't understand the concept. We never ever got how we got to places, whether even the taxi driver knew who we were and would afford to put us into his taxi and take us, knowing that he was not going to be paid. Today, money precedes everything. When you ask somebody to volunteer, they tell you, how much am I going to be paid? Volunteerism today is attached to payment and remuneration. We never got paid. Theatre that we did, I didn't know what it was to be ever paid a salary or paid even a pittance, a bus fare to go to places. We hitched, we walked, we did things without any monetary attachments to it. So coming back to commitment, and that is where consciousness comes in. The consciousness of understanding my being and who I am in relation to who you are. And if we say that we are together and we need to be doing something, for instance, what we used to do over weekends, clean the street. You came through our area at the moment. We did cause this litter. Who caused that litter? Where is the consciousness of saying, I cannot throw a piece of paper outside a taxi window or out of that bus? Or when I'm eating something, walk down. The consciousness of health was absolutely vital in our teaching. And that is where the health education comes about. Our clinics had to be changed no matter where you went, whether you sat in the bus. Today people don't even talk to each other. Communication with the person next door and say, hey, hi. Even on the queue in the bus queues or even in the supermarkets, saying to the person next door, hi, how are you? Where are you coming from? this has become a way of life. And that is what Black consciousness is. It's a way of life. And it is out of that consciousness that you will begin to build relationships no matter where you've come from. Oh, you come from, for instance. My husband thinks I'm crazy, but we live this way. This is how we live. I speak to everybody irrespective. I don't care, but I need to know who you are. We don't know each other anymore. And that was one of our conscientizing. Bus stops, you name it. If you're sitting on the train, I mean, if you know that Masibudi Magena was caught just talking on a train to two guys when he was on his way to do some work in the most rural areas, and they got arrested. But he was only talking to them, and he was accused of infiltrating, and he was recruiting for. No, but getting to know somebody was recruitment. I mean, even when I was imprisoned with a whole group of women, they said to me, when we come back, the only thing we'll see is bones, because they'll be putting you with all these women who will tear you down. But by the time they came in, we were busy chatting. The women saw me pregnant and they wanted to know why I was there. Then we started talking about the reasons of their imprisonment. So no matter where we were, theatre, we didn't have, how did we do this? We didn't go and get halls. We would stand at street corners and we would start a conversation and imagine something, and we will start talking about what it is. And people around us would be listening. So we took life very seriously in terms of conscientization. But coming back to your question again as to, so how do we mop up? That is one of the strategies, the strategy of getting people aware of what is happening. Street committees. If somebody is hurt for some reason or the other, you're there to help. If somebody is unable to get things done, in this street we are 11 people. But do you know how united we are? We have street parties. We bring people together. We talk to them about what is happening. We talk of, when there is a crisis, we are there to help each other. We still cook and feed and share. Because the whole concept of sharing, no child in this street is left neglected. Every child in this street is your child. And that's the most important concept that you need to build in. But because of the manner in which we are faced today, that kind of community spirit, so that if nobody comes to hurt, as much as we've had a number of break-ins here, but they've come from outside. Anybody here, if there's anything, we're all there for each other. That is how you have to build community, build trust, build understanding, build sharing, build that concept. And if you know that we are here for each other, then you have no problem. I don't know if that's giving your idea of resistance and resilience. No, if anybody is ill, we're there to help, to make sure nobody, there's no starving, nobody, we've got 4 homes, 4 homes unemployed people. We all serve and we all give and we all make sure that they're nobody. 3 of them are without a single parent. But we are there for them. We buy groceries and we share. That was part of our program, Black community programs, in terms of the building of co-ops. We know that if I buy a pocket of potatoes, what am I going to do with a pocket of potatoes? I need to give somebody else, and we shared it. So it's a question of sharing. And that is how our co-ops started. That you would get, under most strained economic conditions, when things were so bad, for instance in Merebank and in Wentworth, they had these co-ops where they had street committees, they would buy groceries and they would share it amongst themselves and share the costs. It's cheaper that way than to go and buy for yourselves as individuals. So it was a question of co-ops that we formed. So you're resisting price increases. You're not buying loads and loads for yourself. You're buying a pocket of oranges, and what am I going to do? We're in a family of 4. What are we going to do with the pocket of oranges? You'll see us doing that here as well. Whatever we get, we send out. So, I don't know if that answers your question.
It does. And also, sometimes we forget the importance of being in community and sharing, because we live in a world where we're so used to moving and being as individuals, as if that's the only way to be. I really am enjoying being in conversation with you. And now maybe we'll ask the last question about the role of women in the Black consciousness movement.
I knew you would come out with that. Okay. I think there was a stage when I wrote something down and I thought about it and I said, I know you would come up with that question. And I want to bring out this whole question of race and women. And a good thing that we actually believed in. As long as racism continues, and the people, not particular sex, is the object of oppression, the women will continue to overlook their own discrimination and dedicate themselves to the liberation of the people. So that's what happened. So as long as oppression was the main cause, irrespective of race, women put the liberation of the nation and the liberation of the people first over even themselves. So women's liberation did not feature as per se as the liberation of the nation. What was the role of the women? We didn't see our role separately. There was no thing about it's a woman's place to do this it came later on because there were issues because of that interconnectedness of oppression from a systemic perspective of race, class, gender, religion, disability, that interconnectedness, and women being the pivotal role that women had to play in all sectors. So from a disability sector, being black, being woman, being poor, those levels of oppression are more important than just being a woman. So we know of the different types of women's liberation movements. Here, within the Black consciousness movement, the level of consciousness of a nation was more important than the women themselves. Irrespective of what was happening in the household, what came first? So when it came to the past laws, it was not just because women had to carry the past. It's because that Women's Day is a fact that women, not only because they went and burnt their passes, the past was a symbol of oppression that they fought against. It was not against women's oppression. It was as a symbol that people are restriction in terms of, and the indignities of what that past meant. Today, what are we doing on Women's Day? We're not looking at the symbols. We have now created Women's Day, but we are not looking at levels of oppression of a nation, of a child. We're separating ourselves from liberating ourselves. So it meant a lot. Later on, when the South African Women's Federation came about, it was the only organization that was banned, first and only women's organization. Yes, we were responsible for starting it. There was an anti-feeling about the South African Federation of Women. South African Women's Federation, not Federation of Women, because that's a different historical section. Because of the fear of the word Black Women's Federation. When it was South African Women's Federation, it was fine. But when it was realized that black women were being oppressed in various ways, from marriage to land ownership, to being infantilized, to losing ownership, of not being recognized as women, and we started the Black Women's Federation, which was the only women's organization that was banned. Then the issues of the women's liberation is a very liberal white phenomenon, because until black women see themselves as part, and that is what we're trying to put through at the Black Women's Federation, as long as women see themselves as separate from the liberation of this country, we are going to see ourselves as a separatist movement. So our forethoughts were, we liberate ourselves as a nation.
Thank you so much, Womxn. It's really wonderful to hear from you about, ways in which we were thinking about liberation and the sort of this intersectional nature in which you were thinking about liberation as a whole. Because one of the things that has happened throughout history is that, firstly, the ways in which the archive exists, you hear certain stories, and sometimes, in the archive there are many instances of women being deliberately erased out in a story, and also the ways in which history is told. The history is told, big man history, women are erased. So it's
we
great.
Must say that women did not take leadership roles or prominent roles. If you see all these organizations, if it hadn't been for the Black Women's Federation of Women, all the organizations, women did not take those roles because they had more on their plate than taking roles. It was not positioning themselves, but the actual work that was being done in the liberation movement, as you will see in the book. I don't know if you've read the reflections of the women have you read the book? You would have seen from all aspects, from education to welfare, to early childhood education, to community programs. We drove it with the men, side by side, because it was our job to do that. We were never marginalized. The responsibility of taking leadership, Mrs. Kware was the first black woman's president for a political organization. You'll see, for instance, Vui Mashalaba. Mamphela's in the book, but she played a big role in Zanin when she was banned there, in the clinics, working side by side. We worked side by side. We were not in any way saying it's not the woman's place to do that.
Okay.
I mean, Debs Machoba was our literacy trainer. Nomsisi Krai was a women's sector, empowering women to realize that they got to participate in our literacy programs. That was vital. We had to uplift women workers, domestic workers. Yes. We did a lot when it came to the literacy training program. But if we didn't do it alone as women, we worked together with the men.
Sure. Thank you so much, Sam, for sharing all of that. I know we've kept you for a long time.
But you need to have something to eat. You know us.
Yes, and then maybe we'll come to this. We have some images here, and maybe the last thing we can do is for you to share some information about what these are and the story they tell.
Oh, okay. The beginning of what was that? Our Eurocentric plays. Most of them are the cultural aspects, which we used dance, drama, music, to use the stage as a means of politicizing audiences. The beginning of stages of Look Back in Anger, for instance. Eurocentric play used even Eurocentric plays, translated them to appeal to black audiences and black conditions of living. So when we did Antigone, Antigone, for instance, is that we played Antigone, and Sats Cooper played Creon. Antigone, we talked about the revolution of an oppressed group of people who are not going to be We changed the scripts completely to suit the material conditions under which we lived. So if it had to be a condition that dealt with housing, we would do that. The Antigone, the backdrop, it was the only play that had a backdrop of the statistics of unemployment, crowded home conditions, stats for education, welfare. We depicted all that, and which we then, that is how our Theatre for Revolt came up. So where we would engage the audiences to participate, so it was participatory theatre, where audiences would participate in our productions and would change scenes for us and say, we wouldn't think that was right, we should do it like that. So we engage, and it would be always questions. At the end of every production, they would come up and say, not criticize, but would address issues that we brought up on stage. So when they left, there's a continuity of that lived experience on stage into their lives. So stage was a reflection of the lives that they lived. So that is what most of our theatre productions were. And we used music, live music. I think we were the only ones when Malombos came and they did the backing for us. Dashiki did another production for us, with us. And the last production Dashiki did was Black Images, and the time when everybody was banned, and it was voices from the past, from the graves, talking about what their experiences were. And we used the stage to try and then mobilize audiences to understand that you don't sit here and accept life the way it is. You need to question. So that's, and that one was Look Back in Anger. That's Look Back in Anger. This was Harold Pinter's The Caretaker. So these the two plays, Look Back in Anger and the caretaker, two written Eurocentric plays which we converted about living in housing conditions. And this one here, was with the Malombos, was Into the Heart of Negritude, when we began to look at what it is to be black and started to put on stage and make people aware of black writers, black poets, and and looking at it from a black perspective, because we were breaking away from all that was white.
Okay, thank you so much for sharing. I'm also very passionate about cultural work and the role that cultural workers continue to play, and also the work of the Forge. Very interested in the voices from the graves and what it would mean in this moment to bring back that production.
Yeah, I gave that the script. It's the only script we have. The script that was, because all other scripts were taken away by the police. That one was used as evidence in the Sasso trial, Sasso 8. So I have a copy of that play. Because all our plays were then written by us. We wrote our own plays.
It would really be lovely if we could bring it back. Hint, hint.
Yeah, we asked, Wits drama students, I gave them the script and said, please use it.
Okay. Love to have it.
Khafela. You know Khafela? He's a lecturer.
Yes, in the arts department.
Yeah, in the drama department.
Okay, so again, this is to say thank you so much, Womxn, for your generosity, for your time, for your patience. I really learned a lot today, and I really do come out of the conversation feeling a sense of responsibility, and thinking about ways in which I can be in community, not only in community where I come from, but in community with comrades, and also thinking about how we can be in solidarity across our various struggles. I like the work of Prof. Ruth Wilson-Gilmore when she talks about solidarity as a radical dependency. I felt a lot of that when you were not only talking about the work that you do now, but taking us through history and through time, and how that idea of radical dependency has always been there. The idea that we can depend on each other, and the idea that we can share.
Yeah.
So I come out of the conversation with these thoughts, and also feeling that sense of responsibility and being in community and being in solidarity. So thank you so much.
Not to mention